She was only hired to protect the Duke's reputation, until he couldn't let her go. The door to Ashford Hall opened before Mara had a chance to knock, and she came face to face with the Duke of Ashford Wren himself, standing in his own doorway, in a plain dark sweater, watching her with steady brown eyes that held none of the apology she might have expected from a man in the middle of a public crisis. She had driven 2 hours from London with a folder of research on the seat beside her and a 12-week plan already forming in her mind. She had been briefed thoroughly by Genevieve Hart at Hartwell and Associates. She had reviewed 3 years of press clippings, media timelines, and legal correspondence. She had prepared for a formal reception by a staff member, a brief wait in an anteroom, and the usual professional choreography of being brought to the client rather than dropped directly into his presence. None of those assumptions held. He was simply there, at his own front door, as if he had been watching from a window and had decided that someone else managing the moment was an unnecessary step. "Miss Ellison," he said. Not warmly, not coldly, just clearly. He stepped back to let her in. She crossed the threshold into the entrance hall of Ashford Hall, and the house received her with the particular authority of spaces that have never once needed to announce themselves. The ceiling was vaulted and painted in cream and gold, aged over centuries to a depth of color that no newly applied paint could replicate. The staircase rose at the center of the room, in a wide, unhurried curve, and the stone floor beneath her feet was pale and worn smooth in the middle, where every foot had passed for hundreds of years. Oil portraits lined the walls from the entrance corridor to its far end, and each painted face had settled into the composed stillness of someone who had understood they were being recorded for the long run of history and had made their expression accordingly. The house smelled of wood smoke and old polished wood and something faintly botanical, like dried lavender tucked somewhere near the baseboards. It smelled, above all, like a house that had been tended by the same careful hands for a very long time. Edward did not give her a tour. He led her down the corridor without speaking, which she noted and accepted. In her experience, clients who talked to fill silence were always the harder ones. He opened a door at the corridor's far end, and she walked into a study with books on 3 walls, a working desk covered in organized stacks of paper, and a fireplace that had recently been lit and was still finding its pace. A rubber-banded folder sat on the corner of the desk. He gestured to the chair facing it and took the one behind it. She opened her portfolio. "My role for the next 12 weeks is to assess the current public narrative around your name, identify where it has been built on inaccuracy or incomplete context, and build a strategy to correct it. I need your full cooperation and your full honesty. Not the version of events you are comfortable with, but the complete one. If there are things you cannot disclose, I need to know that too, so I can work around them rather than inadvertently into them." He held her gaze and said, "I understand." She reached across and picked up the rubber-banded folder from the corner of his desk without asking for permission. He made no move to stop her. She worked the band off and read the first article in the stack. It was dated 14 months ago. The headline across the top read, "Duke of Ashford Wren spotted leaving club at 4 a.m. What is he running from?" A photograph below it showed a tall man in a dark coat stepping down from the entrance of a Mayfair building into the back of a car. The photograph was blurred by the speed of the shot and the darkness of the street, but the caption had already decided what it meant: disheveled and distressed. She read the body of the article in under 2 minutes. 8 paragraphs of crafted insinuation. Every sentence technically defensible. Every sentence engineered to produce a specific impression that had nothing to do with any verifiable fact. She had read things like it hundreds of times. She knew exactly how it was built. She looked up. He was watching her read. "The actual context of this," she said. "That evening I attended a working dinner on behalf of a charitable foundation I support," he said. His tone was even, not defensive, not performing calm, just even. The discussion concerned a proposed expansion of a mentoring program in Somerset and Wiltshire. It ran later than expected. I left when the photograph was taken. He paused for a single beat. My father had been told 11 days before this article was published that his illness had entered its terminal phase. He died 9 days after it appeared in print. Mara set her pen down. "The press were not aware of his illness," he continued, in the same measured voice. "He requested complete privacy. His wish was honored." So the photograph was taken without any understanding of its context, she said. Yes. The journalist saw a tired man in a dark coat getting into a car at 4 in the morning. The story was written around that image, and since I provided no alternative explanation, the default explanation was the one that sold. And there was no correction issued. No, Philip, my solicitor, made the assessment that engaging would increase the coverage rather than limit it. He was likely right for that specific incident, but the pattern of non-engagement over the following months produced a secondary problem, which is that silence began to read as confirmation. She opened her pen again and wrote that down. The strategy changes from here. Part of what I am building is the basis for your side of events to exist in the record. Silence has served its purpose. It is now working against you. He nodded once, slowly. She moved through the folder. The cancelled engagement was the story she had been most curious about. His former fiancée was Diana Alcott, whose family had maintained a long connection to the Ashford Wren estate across several generations. The press had constructed the narrative around a supposed public confrontation at a party in Belgravia. 3 different publications had published 3 different versions of what was said and who had initiated it. Since neither Edward nor Diana had made any public comment, those 3 conflicting accounts had lived side by side in the press archive for nearly 2 years, each one as official as the other, and none of them sourced to anyone who had actually been in the room. Which version is closest to accurate? Mara asked. None of them, he said. There was no public confrontation. The engagement ended in a private conversation. We both recognized that it had been agreed to too quickly, and for reasons that were partly to do with our family's expectations, and not enough to do with what either of us personally wanted. The conversation was not easy, but it was honest. We parted on terms that we both chose. Why has the press account been so dramatically different? Because the press account was built in the absence of any other account, he said. An editor choosing between a quiet private agreement and a dramatic rupture will always choose the drama. And we gave them the space to choose it by saying nothing. Are you currently in contact with her? No, we have not spoken in approximately 6 months. Is there a risk she speaks publicly in the next 12 weeks? I hope not, he said. I believe not, but I cannot guarantee it. Mara nodded. If she were to speak publicly, is there anything she could say that would be factually accurate and damaging to this process? The pause before his answer was fractionally longer than his other pauses. She registered it. There is one thing, he said. The press believes that she ended the engagement. The truth is that I ended it. I have never corrected that version, because correcting it would have placed the press attention squarely on her, and she had done nothing to deserve that. Mara looked at him across the desk. She thought about what it meant to absorb the public's harsher interpretation of a story for nearly 2 years, without objection, in order to spare someone else the weight of it. She thought about the particular cost of that. She wrote something in her notebook and moved on. The Members Club incident turned out to involve a business disagreement with a former associate named Warren Flint, overheard by a journalist who had been dining at the same private club and mischaracterized as something more dramatic than it was. Warren Flint had since privately acknowledged to Philip Croft that his account to the press had been exaggerated, but he had not offered to say so on the record. Would he, if approached correctly? Mara asked. Possibly, Edward said. He is not a malicious man. He was angry when he spoke to the journalist. He is less angry now. She made a note. Approach Warren Flint through Philip. Third option, not the opening move. The financial recklessness story was last. A property in Oxfordshire sold under circumstances a journalist had interpreted as financial pressure. The reality was that the property had been sold at a specific point for a specific reason. To fund a grant to a historic buildings restoration trust in Gloucestershire. The grant had been made without Edward's name attached to it. Why without your name? She asked. He looked at her as if the question had surprised him. Because the trust needed the funding, he said, not the association. She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote it down. They finished at late afternoon, when the fire had burned to a steady glow, and the November light outside the window had gone the deep gray of early dusk. She had filled 30 pages of her notebook. She had also, without deciding to do so, stopped thinking of the man across the desk as a file to be managed, and started thinking of him as someone with a great deal of unread text beneath the public surface. She closed her portfolio. I have enough to begin. I will need access to Helen's files and a meeting with Philip Croft within the next 2 days. Both can be arranged by tomorrow morning, he said. She stood, and he stood with her. She had worked with senior executives who did not stand when a contractor left the room. The detail was small, and she registered it. Miss Ellison, he said, before she reached the door. She turned. He was standing behind the desk, with his hands loose at his sides. In the firelight, he looked nothing like the tabloid character she had spent the past week reading about. He looked like someone who had been carrying a substantial weight for a long time, and had grown so accustomed to it that he no longer thought about the carrying. He just carried. I want to be clear about what I am asking you for, he said. I am not asking you to make me seem better than I am. I am asking you to ensure that what I actually am becomes visible, only that. She looked at him steadily. That is the most straightforward brief I have been given in 7 years, she said. Something in his face shifted. Not much, but enough to notice. She left the study. Mrs. Portman showed her to the guest wing with quiet efficiency. The room was large and well prepared, with a window that looked out over a formal garden, running in neat geometric lines toward the open fields of the Wiltshire countryside. The box hedges along the garden paths were trimmed with the kind of precision that reflected a long-standing personal standard, rather than seasonal effort. Mara set her case on the bed, and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the gray November sky, sitting low, and even over the fields. She had handled complicated clients before, politicians with things to hide, executives whose private record contradicted their public one, people who were guilty and needed her to minimize the damage, people who were falsely accused and needed her to prove it. She had handled all of those, and she had done it well, and she had left each engagement with her record clean and her professional distance intact. She told herself that this one was no different. She unpacked her laptop, set up her workspace on the writing desk beside the window, and got to work. Philip Croft's files arrived electronically at 5:30. She worked through them before dinner, ate the tray that Mrs. Portman sent up without interrupting her flow, and returned to the desk by 8. By midnight, she had the 12-week plan shaped in a working document. The plan was, at its core, straightforward. The problem was the absence of narrative. 3 years of careful silence had created a vacuum, and the press had filled every inch of it with the most interesting available interpretation of every incident. The solution was not to manufacture warmth or charm. It was to release facts, selectively, strategically, in the right order, and through the right people. A print interview with a journalist she trusted, focused on the charitable work Edward had been doing, without announcement. A public appearance that was purposeful, rather than performative. A response framework, so that Philip's office was no longer reacting to stories, but actively shaping the terms of engagement. It was not glamorous work. It was never glamorous when it was done properly. The visible result would look effortless. The scaffolding required to produce that effortlessness was what she was there to build, quietly, over 12 weeks. She worked until past 1 in the morning, and then went to the kitchen for tea. The kitchen at Ashford Hall was large and practical, and quiet at that hour, with pale stone floors and a wide old hearth and modern appliances that sat comfortably in the space without announcing themselves. A covered plate sat on the counter. Beside it, a small piece of cream notepaper. She lifted the cover. Sandwiches, cut neatly, 2 kinds. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was precise and slightly narrow. She had spent 4 hours watching it across a desk. In case you are still working at an unreasonable hour. No signature. She stood in the kitchen for a moment that was slightly longer than the moment required. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, poured tea from the small pot beside the plate, and ate. The sandwiches were good, simple, well-made, exactly what was wanted at that hour. The kitchen was quiet around her. Outside, the Wiltshire night was still. She rinsed the cup and the plate and left the kitchen clean, and walked back to the guest wing. She had 11 weeks and 5 days remaining. She was going to do this job well, and when it was done, she was going to leave cleanly and professionally. And that was the full extent of the plan. She lay in the unfamiliar dark of the guest room and told herself she was too alert because of the coffee she had drunk while working. She almost believed it. She set the rules on the 3rd morning. Not out loud, because saying them out loud would have required acknowledging that there was something to set rules against, and she was not prepared to do that. She set them in her own mind, in the quiet clarity of 7 in the morning, while she drank the first cup of tea of the day, in the east-facing window of the guest room, and watched the frost on the garden catch the early light. She was a professional. She was here to do a specific job with a specific timeline. She would be thorough, and she would be honest, and she would be effective. She would not ask personal questions beyond what the work required. She would not share personal information beyond what was courteous. She would not treat this estate as anything other than a temporary work environment, and she would not treat its owner as anything other than a client. She had worked in close proximity to clients before. The nature of crisis communications was, by definition, intimate. She learned things about people that their closest friends did not know, sat across from them during some of the most pressured weeks of their lives, and then left. The intimacy was professional. It always ended. She knew how to hold the line. The rules were simple, and she knew what they were, and she set about following them. By 9 that morning she was in a meeting with Helen, who had recovered enough from her cold to come in for several hours, and who turned out to be sharply organized and genuinely relieved to have a strategy being implemented. Helen had worked for the estate's communications function for 4 years, and she had spent most of those years managing the external perception of the Ashford Wren name with too few tools and too little support. She walked Mara through the existing media contacts, the relationships that were warm and the ones that had cooled, the editors, who had shown basic good faith, and the ones who had published aggressively, regardless of the information provided. "There is a journalist at the National Record," Helen said. "Her name is Frances Webb. She has approached us twice in the past 18 months, wanting to do a profile piece. Her work is serious. She does not sensationalize." Helen paused. "I was not given authorization to respond to either approach." "Why not?" Mara asked. Helen glanced toward the corridor, then back. The Duke was not prepared to engage at that point. She said carefully, "Is Frances Webb still open to the conversation?" "I believe so. I can reach out to her office this afternoon if you want." "Do that," Mara said. "Tell her we are interested in a conversation about a profile. No commitments yet, just a conversation." Helen nodded with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly that. Philip Croft arrived at 11. He was a careful, composed man in his late 50s, who had represented the Ashford Wren family's interests for 12 years, and who looked at Mara the way experienced solicitors always looked at communications consultants, with cautious respect and the mild concern of someone who understood that public relations and legal strategy did not always point in the same direction. She had dealt with that dynamic before. She managed it by asking the right questions and making it immediately clear that she was not interested in circumventing legal boundaries, only in working within them as efficiently as possible. By the end of the meeting, Philip was satisfied. He offered 2 additional pieces of information that he had not included in the written files: a note from Warren Flint's solicitor, indicating that Warren was, in his words, open to reconsidering the record, and a detail about the youth mentoring programs that surprised Mara, even given what she already knew about their scale. "He has been funding it for 6 years, Philip said. The operating cost in the most recent financial year was significant. It has never been publicly acknowledged by him." "Not once?" Mara said. "Not once," Philip confirmed. "He has declined every invitation to have his name associated with the programs. The participants and staff know who funds it. No one else does." She thanked Philip and walked back to the main study, where she had set up her working station alongside Helen's desk on the side table. She sat down, opened her laptop, and pulled up the notes she had taken from his files about the mentoring initiative. 6 years, 4 counties, hundreds of young people, 0 public attribution. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the document she had titled AW Communications Recovery, Phase 1, and began writing a section she had not originally planned to include. Not a press release, not a statement, just a framework for the truthful introduction of something that was already true and had simply never been allowed to be seen. She was working on the 3rd draft of that section when the door of the study opened and Edward came in. He stopped when he saw that she was still at the work table. He had apparently expected the room to be empty. "I can go elsewhere," she said, beginning to close her laptop. "No," he said. "Stay." He moved toward the bookshelves at the far end of the room. "I just needed something." She returned to her screen. He moved along the shelves, pulling a volume out, then returning it, then finding what he was looking for, and taking it to the armchair beside the fireplace. She kept her eyes on her work, and he kept his on his book. and the room was quiet, in the way that comfortable rooms are quiet. Not awkward, not loaded, just shared. She did not look up at him. She was aware that she was making a deliberate choice not to look up at him, and she was aware that making a deliberate choice to avoid something was not quite the same as the thing not existing, but she set that observation aside and kept working. After 40 minutes, he closed the book, stood, and left the room without speaking again. She kept working for another 2 hours before she noticed that her tea had gone completely cold, and she had not registered it. That evening, after dinner, she had accepted the dining room that night and sat across from him at one end of the long table with Helen, who was still building her energy back, and Mrs. Portman's excellent cooking, and the comfortable formality of a household that knew how to make a table feel like a proper meal without making it feel like a performance. She went back to the guest room and called Lucy. Lucy had been her closest friend since university. She was practical, direct, and had a specific talent for hearing the thing underneath the thing. "How is it?" Lucy asked. "Fine," Mara said. "Good, actually. Unusual client, but the work is clear." "Unusual how?" She thought about it. "Unusually honest," she said. "That's different from your usual." "It is." A pause. "And is he? What's he like?" "He's fine," Mara said. "He's a private person. He's been misrepresented. I'm here to fix that." Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You answered a different question than the one I asked." "I answered the relevant question," Mara said. "Right," Lucy said, in the tone she used when she was filing information away for later. "The work is interesting," Mara said, firmly. "That is all." "Okay," said Lucy, in that same tone. They talked for another 20 minutes about other things, and Mara went to sleep at a reasonable hour, and in the morning she was back at the work table by 8, and the rules were intact, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. The first real test came on day 6. She was reviewing the draft questions she intended to send to Francis Webb's editor when her phone rang and showed a number she recognized. A journalist named Colin Marsh, who worked for one of the middle-tier tabloids and who had a particular habit of ringing consultants directly rather than going through official channels, because he had once discovered that this sometimes produced results. "Miss Ellison," he said, when she answered, "I understand you're working for Ashford Wren." She had expected this. News moved in the press community faster than it moved anywhere else. "I'm not confirming or discussing any client relationships," she said. "Fair enough," he said. "Then I'll just mention, as general conversation, that I have been given information about a letter that was sent between the Duke and his former fiancée during the period of their engagement, and that the letter is not entirely, how shall I put it, consistent with the version of events that has been told." She kept her voice entirely level. "I'm not sure why you're telling me that." "I'm telling you," he said, "because I'm a thorough journalist, and I like to give people the opportunity to comment before I publish." "Then, when you have something publishable, send a formal comment request to the estate's legal team," she said. "That's the appropriate channel." She ended the call. She sat for a moment, with her hands still on the phone. Then she opened a new email and wrote to Philip Croft with 3 lines. "Colin Marsh from the Evening Standard has referenced an alleged letter between Edward and Diana Alcott. I need to know if this exists. Please call when you can." She sent it, set the phone face down on the desk, and went back to her work. Philip called 40 minutes later, and they spoke for 20 minutes. There had been letters. There were always letters in an engagement, he said. He was reasonably confident that whatever Colin Marsh had been shown was not the most damaging material available, because the most damaging material was in his own files and accounted for, but he could not be certain without seeing what Marsh had. "I'll handle it," Mara said. "Say nothing to anyone today. Let me see what Marsh actually intends." She handled it. Over the following 2 days, she made 3 calls, wrote 2 careful responses to questions that had been framed as general inquiries, and established, through careful and indirect contact, that the letter Colin Marsh had been given was one of several that existed, but that the specific content he had been shown, though personal, contained nothing that could not be contextualized. The story he was building would not hold at the level he had hoped. By the end of the week, it had not appeared in print. On Friday evening, she was in the library, going over the following week's schedule, when she heard steps in the corridor. Edward came in, apparently on his way to one of the bookshelves, and stopped when he saw her at the long reading table. "I heard that Colin Marsh made contact," he said. "Helen told you," she said. It wasn't a question. "She told Philip. Philip told me." He moved to the shelf and pulled a book without looking at it. "How serious was it?" "Manageable," she said. "It is managed." He nodded. He stood there for a moment, not quite at the shelf and not quite in the conversation. "You didn't mention it to me directly," he said. "It wasn't necessary," she said. "My job is to handle these things. Bringing you into every contact would create more pressure than it removes." He looked at her. "I would still have preferred to know," he said. She considered this. "All right," she said. "Going forward, I'll inform you when external contacts are made, even if I am managing them directly." A pause. "Is that what you would like?" "Yes," he said. Simply, without apology for having a preference. She made a note of it and went back to the schedule. He did not leave immediately. He stood at the shelf for another moment, then said, more quietly, "Thank you for managing it." She looked up. He was already turning back toward the door, and his face was turned just slightly away from her, and she thought that the thanks had cost him something. Not because he was reluctant to give it, but because he was someone who was not used to needing to give it. "It's the job," she said. He nodded and left. She worked for another hour after that, and when she finally closed her notebook, the library was dark except for the lamp on the reading table and the glow of the fire, and she sat for a moment in the quiet of it. The old smell of the books, the gentle sound of the fire, the extraordinary stillness of the house around her, and she thought, "This is a good place. This is a very good, very quiet place." Then she turned the lamp off and went to bed. 7 days down, 5 weeks and 5 days remaining. Still entirely professional, still entirely on track. She told herself that firmly and specifically. But she was aware, in the same breath, that she had stopped wanting the weeks to move quickly. The profile piece was the first thing that worked exactly as she had planned. It had taken 3 weeks to arrange. Frances Webb was experienced enough to know the difference between a source who wanted puff coverage and a source who had a genuine story to tell, and careful enough to insist on 2 separate conversations with Edward before she would commit to the framing. The first conversation, conducted by phone, had been careful on both sides. The second, done in person at a neutral location in London, had been more open. Mara had been present for neither. She had set the parameters, prepared Edward with a briefing document that she had written with precise attention to what to say and what to leave for the journalist to discover on her own, and then stepped back. That was the part most clients found hardest, the stepping back. People in crisis tended to want to control every word. They wanted to see the questions in advance, rehearse every answer, manage the journalist as if they were managing a press release. Mara's method was different. She prepared people for the conversation. Then she trusted them to have it. She had prepared Edward thoroughly. "She will ask you about the engagement," Mara had told him, the evening before the second conversation with Frances. They were in the main sitting room of the hall, which Mara had been using as a secondary workspace. He was seated in the chair opposite her, which had become, over the weeks, their standard arrangement for briefings. You do not have to discuss it in detail, but you cannot deflect it entirely, or the piece will be structured around the deflection. "What would you suggest?" he asked. "I would suggest that you say, honestly, that it ended on terms both parties agreed to, that you respect Diana's privacy and are not going to speak for her experience of it, and that you consider it a chapter that has been discussed publicly in less accurate terms than the reality." She paused. That answer gives the journalist something honest to print. It closes the topic without sensationalizing it, and it treats Diana with the dignity she is owed. He had listened carefully. He had asked 2 questions. He had then said he understood, and she had believed him, because in 3 weeks she had learned that when he said he understood something, he did. The piece ran on the final Saturday of the 5th week. It was 2 pages in the Broadsheets weekend supplement. Frances had written it with the thoughtful intelligence that Helen had predicted. She had anchored it in the youth mentoring program. Edward had, at Mara's suggestion, taken Frances to visit one of the Somerset sites, and the photograph that ran with the piece showed him in conversation with 3 young people around a workshop table, and the photograph was honest and specific, and entirely unlike the blurred nighttime photographs that had run under unkind headlines. The piece said nothing untrue. It said a great deal, that had not previously been said. It gave context to the father's death, treated the cancelled engagement with the brevity and dignity Mara had suggested, and described the financial situation accurately. It did not use the word redemption, which Mara had specifically asked Francis to avoid, because redemption implied that there had been genuine wrongdoing, and there had not been. She was in the kitchen when the weekend edition went online. She refreshed the link 3 times to be sure it had loaded correctly, read the piece once from beginning to end without stopping, and then read it again. It was good. It was the kind of good that came from a journalist who had done the work and found something worth writing. Not perfect. There were 2 lines she would have preferred differently phrased, but good. She made a cup of tea and went to the library to look at the early response coming through on the monitoring tools she had set up for the estate. It was still early in the morning. The response would build through the day. She was an hour into tracking it when she heard the door behind her open, and she looked up, and Edward was standing in the doorway. He had clearly seen the piece. The quality of his stillness was different from its usual form, not the habitual control of a private man in public, but something closer to the stillness of someone who has been caught off guard by something they were not prepared for. She looked at him. "It is running well," she said. "The early response is positive." He did not say anything immediately. He walked into the room and stopped at the edge of the reading table and looked at the monitoring screen she had open on her laptop. Social commentary. Editorial responses from 3 other publications already, all of them recalibrating in the direction the piece had set. "This is what you do," he said. Not exactly to her, and not exactly to himself. More as if he was saying something out loud that he had been processing privately. "This is what I do," she confirmed. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at her directly. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I understand the work involved in producing something like this. It does not look like work, from the outside. I understand that the invisible part is the significant part." She looked at him. In 3 years of working in this field, she could not immediately recall a client who had said anything resembling that. "Thank you," she said. "You haven't had a day off," he said. "I'm sorry?" "In 5 weeks," he said. "You've been working every day since you arrived. You haven't taken a day off." She blinked. "I don't generally take days off in an active engagement." "That seems unreasonable," he said. He said it with the same measured tone he used for everything, so it was not an admonishment, just an observation. "It's the nature of crisis work," she said. "On Sunday," he said, "if the press response has settled by then, which I believe it will, I would like to suggest that you take the day." He paused. "The estate has several good walks. The grounds extend to the river at the south end. Mrs. Portman makes a considerable Sunday lunch." Another pause. "You could, of course, choose to do none of those things and simply rest in your room. I am not issuing a directive. I am suggesting." She looked at him. He was quite serious. His expression was the particular one she had come to recognize as his version of mild discomfort, the slight set of the jaw that appeared when he had said something personal and was uncertain how it would be received. "I'll consider it," she said. He nodded and started back toward the door. "The piece is good," he said, from the doorway, without turning around. "You should feel good about it." The word "felt" had clearly required a small internal decision on his part. He left. She turned back to the monitoring screen. The response was continuing to build. 3 more editorial recalibrations had come through in the last 10 minutes. The comments beneath Francis's article were, with a few exceptions, running in the direction she had targeted. She sat in the library with the early morning sun coming through the tall windows, and she felt, precisely as he had suggested, good about the work. She also felt something else, alongside it, that was harder to categorize, and that she decided not to try to categorize until after the 12 weeks were over. On Sunday, she did take the walk to the river. The path ran through the estate's lower fields and along the edge of a wood that had been there, Arthur Gale told her when she passed him on the way out, since before the hall was built. The river at the south end of the grounds was wide and calm, and the color of pewter under the November sky. She stood at the bank for a while, in the cold, watching the water move. It was the first time in 5 weeks that she had not been thinking about the work. She was thinking, instead, about the note left in the kitchen on the first night, the book in the library that she had not yet looked closely at, the way he stood in the doorway of rooms, with the particular quality of someone who was careful about whether he entered, The expression on his face that morning when he saw the piece, before he had put his composure back in place. She stood at the river for a long time. She was careful, on the walk back, to note the exact location of the line she had drawn for herself at the start of this engagement. The line was still there. That was important. It was there, and she could see it. What she could also see, with the honesty she applied to everything when she was alone and not performing professionalism, was that the line had not moved. But she had. She went back to the hall and ate Mrs. Portman's Sunday lunch, and it was, as promised, considerable. That evening, after dinner, she found a book on the small table outside the guest room. It was a first edition, she realized, when she picked it up and looked at the copyright page. A novel she had mentioned, in passing, 3 weeks ago in a conversation with Helen, that she had not realized he was close enough to hear. She had said, offhandedly, that it was one of the books she had never quite got around to reading, but had always intended to. The cover was worn with age and careful handling. There was no note inside, no inscription, nothing that required acknowledgement. She stood in the corridor outside the guest room with the book in both hands. Then she went inside, sat on the bed, and opened the first page. She read until midnight. The east wing of Ashford Hall had been closed for nearly 3 years, when it opened again in the middle of the 6th week. Mrs. Portman noticed first, because Mrs. Portman noticed everything in the hall with the quiet competence of someone who had been the connective tissue of the household through 4 different Ashford Wren family periods, and had developed the kind of comprehensive awareness of the building's rhythms that most people reserved for their own heartbeats. The windows of the east wing that faced the garden had been shuttered since the old Duke's death. One Tuesday morning in November, coming around the south path from the kitchen garden, she saw that the shutters on the first 2 windows had been opened. The rooms inside were being aired. She mentioned it to Arthur Gale that afternoon, and Arthur noted it with a slow nod and no particular commentary, which was his standard response to anything he considered significant. He had learned, over 27 years, that the things worth noting at Ashford Hall rarely required immediate words. What Arthur had already noticed, and had been noting for 3 weeks without saying anything, was something simpler. The Duke was eating dinner at the proper hour. For the better part of a year before Mara's arrival, Edward had eaten at his desk, and usually late, and the trays that came back to the kitchen had suggested that the eating had been perfunctory, the food of someone fueling themselves, rather than someone eating a meal. Since roughly the 2nd week of Mara's engagement, the evening tray had stopped. He had been sitting down at the dining table, sometimes with Helen, sometimes with Mara, occasionally just with the household staff, and he had been eating properly, and, on 3 occasions that Arthur was aware of, had stayed at the table past the end of the meal to continue a conversation. Arthur had told Mrs. Portman about the dining change approximately a week after it began. Mrs. Portman had listened, said nothing, and filed the information. She added it to 3 other things she had observed: that the study fire was now lit every morning, rather than whenever he got around to requesting it, that the books on the library table had begun to be replaced at a different pace, suggesting more reading rather than the same volumes sitting undisturbed, and that she had twice heard him laugh, once in the corridor outside the study, and once in the kitchen at an unreasonable hour, in a way that was quick and genuine, and nothing like the restrained social laughter she had been hearing for 14 months. She mentioned the laughing to Arthur. Arthur had paused in his work and said, "Good." That was the full extent of the staff commentary on the matter. Mrs. Portman and Arthur were, between them, people of considerable discretion, and they understood that their observations were for their own keeping, and not for any other purpose. But they both held the knowledge of what they were observing with something that was not quite hope, because they were too practical for hope, but was in the same neighborhood. Mara, meanwhile, was managing the 6th week of the engagement with the same focused efficiency she had brought to the first 5. The Francis Webb piece had produced exactly the recalibration she had intended. 3 follow-up articles in other publications had referenced it. The online sentiment monitoring showed a measurable shift in the tone of commentary associated with Edward's name. Philip Croft had reported that the calls from editor representatives to his office, which had previously been adversarial in character, had moved toward the more neutral. The broad shape of the public narrative was turning. There was also movement on the Warren Flint front. Mara had spoken to Warren's solicitor twice, and the solicitor had confirmed that Warren was prepared to provide a clarifying statement about the members' club incident if the approach was made correctly. Low profile, No press conference. Simply a brief written statement provided to Philip's office and made available if journalists requested it. It was not a dramatic development, but it was a useful one, and it closed off one of the remaining pressure points. She was tracking all of this in the document that had grown from a 12-week plan into a living record of the engagement's progress. And she was aware, with the professional satisfaction she allowed herself when things were going well, that the work was working. She was also aware, with the less manageable feeling she had been having since the Sunday walk to the river, that something outside the work was also happening, and that it was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend otherwise. She had not spoken to Lucy again about it. She had called Lucy twice in the 6th week, and both times the conversation had stayed on safe ground. Work, general news, a story about a mutual friend's new job. Lucy had not asked again about Edward. Mara had not brought him up, but she was aware that she was not bringing him up with a particular deliberateness, and that Lucy, who knew her well enough to notice a deliberate omission, had not pushed the point, and that both of these things were a form of conversation without any words being exchanged. She visited the Somerset mentoring site on a Wednesday in the 6th week. Edward had arranged for one of the program coordinators, a woman named Claire Hargrove, to meet her and show her the facilities. Mara went because she needed to understand the scope of the program in enough detail to build a broader piece around it for the second phase of the communications plan. Not just Francis Webb's profile, but a sustained, longer-term effort to make this part of the record. The site was in a converted farm building on the edge of a village outside Taunton. 6 young people were working on a construction project in the main space, learning basic carpentry and building techniques. Claire introduced her around, explained the program's history, showed her the workshop and the small classroom, and the record of participants who had gone on to apprenticeships and employment. Mara had walked through the space with the notebook she carried everywhere, taking the notes she needed for the communications strategy. Then she had talked to some of the participants, because that was also useful. Direct testimony from program beneficiaries was one of the most powerful tools available in the kind of piece she was building. One of the participants, a young man of about 17 named George, had asked her what she did. She explained, briefly. He had looked at her with the directness that young people often had when they had not yet learned to be indirect, and said, "So you help people whose reputation has gone wrong?" "Yes," she said. "And you're helping him?" He meant Edward. "I am," she said. George had nodded. "He came last month and helped us with the roof section," he said, nodding toward the upper structure of the converted building. "He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He just showed up, worked all day." He looked at her with the same directness. "He's all right." She had written that down in her notebook, not for the press strategy, just for herself. On the drive back to Ashford Hall, she had been quiet in a way that was different from her usual working quiet. The fields ran alongside the road in the November afternoon, bare and wide, and she had looked at them without seeing them, because what she was actually seeing was the young man at the mentoring site pointing upward at a section of roof and saying, with complete simplicity, "He just showed up. He worked all day." She had managed the public conversation about Edward Ashford Wren for 6 weeks now. She had read everything ever written about him. She had sat across from him for hours and asked questions that most people would have considered intrusive, and he had answered them all with the particular quiet honesty she had come to think of as the defining characteristic of the man underneath the title. She had watched him interact with his staff, and his solicitor, and Francis Webb, and the estate, and every single thing she had watched was consistent with the picture the estate's own people had of him, which was also consistent with what George had said in a converted barn in Somerset. He just showed up. She arrived back at the hall in the early evening. She went directly to the library, because she had notes to process, and found the room quiet, and the fire lit, and a cup of tea on the reading table that was still warm. She stood at the table for a moment. She had been very careful about the rules she had set herself in the first week. She had followed them with complete consistency. She had not crossed any line that she had drawn for herself, and she had not done anything that a strictly objective observer could point to as a deviation from professional conduct. But she had been sitting with a feeling for 3 weeks now that she had run out of ways to describe as anything other than what it was, and the tea, warm, precisely placed, unrequested, a small quiet act of attentiveness that had been happening in various forms since the first night, and the covered plate of sandwiches, was one thread in a pattern that she could not pretend, any longer, was only professional courtesy. She sat down at the reading table and opened her notebook and worked for the rest of the evening. But she drank the tea first, and she was aware, as she did, that she was doing so with something that was not entirely gratitude, but was in the same neighborhood. The groundskeeper, Arthur Gale, found her the next morning on the south path with her coat pulled against the cold and her notebook open, which she had taken to doing on mornings when the thinking was not going well indoors. He slowed his wheelbarrow and looked at her with the particular patience of a man who had no interest in unnecessary conversation, but also no interest in passing someone by when they were clearly thinking hard about something. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Morning." "Morning, Arthur," she said. He set the wheelbarrow down. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. "Yes," she said. "The work's going well," he said. It was not a question. "I think so," she said. He looked at her for a moment, in the clear morning. He was not a man who said things he had not considered. "He's not what people think," Arthur said. "He never has been. He doesn't make noise about himself. Some people think that means there's nothing there. There's plenty there." He picked up the barrow handles again. "Just thought you should know that." "I know it," she said. And then, because it was true, she said, "I've known it for a while." Arthur nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he had suspected, and continued down the path. She stood in the cold morning for another minute. Then she went inside and made her tea and got to work, and did not let herself think about what Arthur's nod had meant, or what her answer had meant, or what any of it would mean when the 12 weeks ended. She had 6 weeks left. She was going to do the work. She was going to do it well. And she was going to stop standing at the south path, talking to groundskeepers about things she was not supposed to be feeling. The story broke on a Tuesday. Mara's phone began going off at 6:47 in the morning, and she knew before she looked at it that something had happened. 6:47 was too early for scheduled contact, and too specific for a routine alert. She reached for the phone on the bedside table and saw 17 notifications in 90 seconds, which was the kind of number that meant something significant had moved. She sat up and read the first notification. The headline on the online edition of the Evening Chronicle read, "Duke's Reputation Rescue, or Reputation Fabrication. The PR woman behind the Ashford Wren relaunch." The byline was Colin Marsh. She went very still. Then she started reading. The article was 3 pages when fully expanded online. It named her name, her firm, her previous clients, a list that was accurate in its facts, and structured to suggest that her presence at Ashford Hall was not an honest attempt to correct a public record, but an orchestrated image manufacturing exercise. It quoted an unnamed source described as a person close to the former engagement, which could mean Diana Alcott, or anyone in Diana's circle, or anyone who wished to create the impression they were close to Diana. It questioned the authenticity of the Frances Webb profile, describing it as arranged and managed rather than independent journalism, which was technically accurate and entirely misleading, in the way that all of Colin Marsh's work was technically accurate and entirely misleading. And at the center of the article, in the 3rd paragraph, was a line that made her stomach tighten. "Miss Ellison's presence at Ashford Hall over the past 7 weeks raises questions not only about the Duke's commitment to authentic public engagement, but about what else is being managed behind closed doors." The insinuation was unmistakable. It was not stated. Nothing was ever stated. But it was there, and it was deliberate, and it had been placed with surgical precision. She was out of bed and dressed in 7 minutes. She called Philip on the way down the corridor. He had already seen it. His tone was controlled, but there was an edge under it. "We need to respond today," he said. "Not to the entire piece. That would give it the attention it's designed to attract, but to the specific claim about Frances Webb's piece. That one we can address directly and accurately." "Agreed," she said. "Draft a statement and send it to me before 9. I'll refine it, and will release through the estate's official channel only. Nothing through me directly. Nothing that makes me part of the story any more than I already am." She ended the call and went to the kitchen. Mrs. Portman was already in. She took one look at Mara's face and put the kettle on without saying anything. Mara sat at the kitchen table and worked through her phone, triaging the contacts. 3 journalists had already sent requests for comment. 2 were fishing. One was Frances Webb herself, who had sent a short message that read, "I've seen it. For the record, My editorial choices were entirely my own. I'll say so if it helps. Mara replied to Francis immediately. Hold for now. Might call on you in the next 48 hours. She heard footsteps on the corridor outside the kitchen, and the door opened, and Edward came in. He had seen it. She could tell immediately. The quality of his stillness was different from its usual form. It was the stillness of someone who had just absorbed something and had not yet decided how to respond to it. He looked at her across the kitchen. I've seen it, he said. I know, she said. I'm managing it. How bad is it? He asked. Manageable, she said. The specific claims are either demonstrably false or structured in ways that we can contextualize. Philip is drafting a response. Frances Webb is prepared to make a statement about her editorial independence, if it becomes necessary. She kept her voice precise and professional. The insinuation in the third paragraph is more difficult, because insinuation cannot be directly refuted without amplifying it. We manage that by not engaging with it. He was quiet for a moment. The insinuation about what is being managed behind closed doors, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know, he said, that I am not concerned about the story. She looked at him. You should be somewhat concerned, she said. It requires careful management. I mean, he said, more carefully, that I am not concerned about what the story implies about me. My concern is, he stopped. The jaw set slightly, the way it always did when he was choosing words. My concern is that you are being made part of this because of your association with me. That is not a consequence you are contracted to absorb. The kitchen was quiet. Mrs. Portman had efficiently and discreetly moved to the far end of the room. Being made part of the story is an occupational risk in this work, Mara said. It has happened before. I know how to handle it. That is not the point, he said. He was looking at her with the full quality of attention she had come to associate with the moments when he was being more direct than his usual measured manner allowed. The point is that it should not have happened, and it has happened because of me. And a pause. I am sorry for it. She held his gaze. She had been in this industry for 7 years. She had been named in articles before. She had been the subject of critical coverage before. She had never had a client apologize for it. Not in that tone. Not with that quality of something that was genuinely personal, rather than professionally appropriate. You don't need to apologize, she said. Her voice was steady. I know I don't need to, he said. I am choosing to. She looked at him for a moment longer than the exchange required. Thank you, she said. Now let me do the work. He stepped back. She turned back to her phone. He poured himself a cup of tea from the pot Mrs. Portman had left, and he sat at the other end of the kitchen table, and they were both silent and working, and the morning moved forward around them. By midday, she had the official response ready and released through the estate channel. Philip had sent a brief, factual letter to the Evening Chronicle, pointing out 3 specific inaccuracies in the piece, each of which was documented. Frances Webb had published a short statement on her own professional social media, confirming the independence of her editorial decisions. 2 editors, who had recalibrated their coverage, following the Frances Webb profile, had contacted Philip independently, to say their assessments remained unchanged. By late afternoon, Colin Marsh's piece had been picked up by 2 smaller outlets and ignored by the larger ones, which was exactly the pattern she had hoped for. The insinuation had not gained traction. The specific factual claims had been addressed. The story had not collapsed the work of the previous 7 weeks. It had tested it, and the test had been passed. She was doing the final update to her monitoring report when Edward appeared in the doorway of the study at 5 o'clock. How is it? He asked. Contained, she said. The story has not been taken up by the main outlets. Philip's letter prompted the Chronicle to add a correction note to the online piece. We're holding at the position we want. He nodded. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she could see that he had something else to say and was deciding whether to say it. Say it, she said, without looking up from the screen. A pause. How are you? He said. She looked up from the screen. He was looking at her, with the kind of directness that he reserved for the moments when he had decided to be direct, regardless of how the directness would land. I'm fine, she said. You've been managing this since 6:47 this morning, he said. You have not stopped. That's the job, she said. I know it's the job, he said. I'm not asking about the job. A pause that had a specific weight to it. I'm asking about you. She held his gaze for a moment. In 7 years of crisis work, with dozens of clients, she could not recall a single instance of a client setting the work down and asking that question in that way. She did not have a professional response for it, because there was no professional category it fitted into. I'm fine, she said again, and this time she meant it more simply. It's been a long day, but the work held. That's what matters. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded and stepped back. Dinner is at 7 if you want it, he said. Mrs. Portman has made something that smells like it will help. She almost smiled. Tell her thank you, she said. She went back to the screen. But she was aware that the work in front of her had a slightly different quality than it had had that morning, and that the difference had something to do with the conversation she had just had, and with the fact that someone had asked how she was, and had meant it. She worked for another 2 hours, and then she went to dinner, and the food was, as Mrs. Portman's food always was, exactly what was wanted. The conversation that changed things happened late on a Thursday night in the 9th week, in the kitchen, and it happened because both of them were there at the same time, for no planned reason at all. Mara had been working late in the study, which was not unusual. Edward had apparently been doing something in the East Wing, which had been progressively reopened over the past 3 weeks, in a way that she had noticed but not commented on. It was past 11 when she went to the kitchen, and she expected to find it empty the way she always expected to find it empty at that hour, and it was not empty, because Edward was standing at the counter in the particular posture of someone who has been thinking hard in a room for a while, and has recently stopped. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Tea? He said. Please, she said. He put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table, which had become, over 9 weeks, the most natural thing in the world to do. The kitchen at 11 at night was the only room in the hall where neither of them performed anything, not professionalism, not the particular social posture of employer and contractor, not the careful courtesy they both applied everywhere else. It was just a kitchen, and it was late, and they were both tired, and the tea was being made. He brought the cups to the table and sat across from her. Outside, the November night was very dark and very still. The kitchen clock counted its steady rhythm. He looked at his tea. The East Wing, he said, without introduction. I have been thinking about what to do with it. She had not brought up the East Wing, but she had noticed it, and he knew she had noticed it. That was the particular economy of communication they had developed without discussing it. They each noticed things the other did not necessarily say, and they had both, at some point, stopped pretending that the noticing wasn't happening. What are you thinking? She said. My father used it as a library, he said. When he was well, he read constantly. The rooms are full of his books. I haven't been able to. A pause. He looked at the tea. I haven't been able to go in there since he died. She did not say anything. I went in last month, he said. For the first time. I'm not certain what prompted it. But I went in, and I went back. And I've been sorting through the books. He looked up at her. I thought I would find it more difficult than it has been. And was it? She asked. Difficult, yes, he said. More than I expected in some ways, and less in others. He paused. He was in there. In the books. In the arrangement of the shelves. In the notes and the margins. He wrote in the margins constantly. It was a quality he and I shared. A slight pause. I found myself arguing with the margins, which is something he would have found satisfying. She looked at him across the table. He was not performing this. He was not giving a managed account of grief for her professional purposes. He was just telling her something true. He sounds like someone worth arguing with, she said. Something in his face shifted. He said. He was infuriating, and extremely well read, and almost always right about things he had no business being right about, and I miss him considerably. The last 3 words were quiet and entirely simple, and she received them the way she received the most important things he said, which was without immediate response. After a moment she said, What was the last conversation you had with him? He looked at her steadily. He asked me whether I was content. He said, Not happy. He was too precise for happy. He thought it was an imprecise word for a complex state. He asked whether I was content. A pause. I told him I was working on it. He said that was, in his view, the right answer. Was it true? She said. When you said it? Partly, he said. I had learned to be content with the estate and with the work. I had not yet learned to be content with the particular kind of quiet that settles into a life when other people are not in it. He paused again. He knew that, I think. He was asking about that specifically. She sat with that for a moment. I almost didn't take this job, she said. He looked at her. Genevieve offered it to me, and my first instinct was to turn it down, she said. I thought it was going to be straightforward reputation management for someone who probably deserved some of what they were getting. And now, he said. Now, she said, it's the most interesting work I've done in 4 years, and the client is nothing like I expected. She paused. That doesn't happen often. What did you expect? He asked. Someone entitled, she said honestly. Someone who was primarily concerned with appearance over accuracy. Someone who wanted to look better, without caring much about the distinction between better and true. And I am not those things, he said. It was not a boast. It was a question asked without a question mark. No, she said. You are not those things. He looked at her. Outside, somewhere in the fields beyond the house, an owl called once and was quiet again. What are you not saying? She asked. He looked at the cup in his hands. I am being careful, he said, about the professional context of this conversation. So am I, she said. A pause that had a specific weight. Then we are both being careful about the same thing, he said. We are, she said. He looked up. Is it working? He asked. She held his gaze. Less well than it was, she said. He nodded, slowly. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her again, with the full direct quality of his attention. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it clearly, and I want you to receive it, without the professional context that usually sits between us. She waited. I do not know how to be casual about things that matter to me, he said. I know that is probably apparent. I have never been easy with the kind of comfortable informality that other people seem to manage without effort. But I have found, over the past 9 weeks, that the context in which you have come to know me is more honest than the context in which most people do, and that what I have come to know of you in that same period is considerable. He paused. He was looking at her directly, without the small protective distance he usually kept. I find that I am not particularly interested in the version of things that does not involve you. I thought that was worth saying, regardless of the professional context. The kitchen clock ticked. She looked at him. She thought about the rules she had set in the first week. She thought about the line she had drawn for herself and maintained carefully and deliberately for 9 weeks. She thought about Lucy's pointed silence on the phone. She thought about Arthur at the South Path, and the East Wing windows being opened, and the book left outside the guest room door. 3 weeks, she said. He looked at her steadily. 3 weeks, she said. That's what's left of the contract. I need to complete it. Not because of the professional formality of it, but because the work is not finished, and I don't do things halfway. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to, he said. I know, she said. I'm not asking you for anything at this moment, he said. I'm only telling you something true. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was completely quiet around them, and the night was very still, and she thought, this is the truest room in the house. This kitchen, this hour, this conversation that was happening, not because of a professional arrangement, but because 2 careful, guarded people had independently run out of ways to not be honest about the same thing. I know, she said again. And then, because she was also running out of ways to not be honest, so am I. Telling you something true, if we are talking about the same thing. I think we are talking about the same thing, he said. She looked at her tea. She looked up. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he said. They sat in the kitchen for another hour, talking about other things, about the remaining steps in the communications plan, about the East Wing books, about a disagreement they had been building toward for 2 weeks about whether the proposed second press interview should be with a political magazine or a general interest one. They argued about the interview choice, with the focused pleasure of people who had discovered that they were well matched for argument. He was wrong about the political magazine. She told him so. He disagreed with considerable precision. She was glad he disagreed, because the disagreement was engaging, and she was fully certain she was correct. And the combination of those things was, she reflected, one of the more reliable indicators of a person worth knowing. She went to bed at 2 in the morning. She did not lie awake. She slept immediately, and well, and without difficulty, for the first time in 9 weeks. The final week arrived faster than any week she had lived through. She had known it would. The last stretch of any engagement always moved differently from the weeks before it, not faster in the sense of less happening, but faster in the sense of everything becoming more concentrated, each day containing more of the texture of the whole. She had lived through it before. She knew the feeling. She had learned to work through it without being distracted by it. This time, the feeling was different in kind. She worked through the final report with the thoroughness she brought to everything. It was detailed and comprehensive and structured in the clear, precise style that she had developed over 7 years of this work. Situation at the start of the engagement, actions taken in each phase, outcomes achieved and outcomes still in progress, recommendations for the 6 months following the engagement's close. She wrote it over 3 days, checking every metric against the monitoring data, every claim against the documented record of what had been done and what had changed. The numbers were good, better than she had initially projected. The press sentiment analysis showed a shift of the kind that usually took 18 to 24 weeks to produce. The specific stories that had framed the narrative for 3 years had each been addressed. The father's death context was now part of the record. The engagement had been treated with the dignified brevity it deserved. The members' club incident had been resolved by Warren Flint's statement. The financial story had been corrected in 3 subsequent pieces. The Francis Webb profile remained the centerpiece, but it had been built into a broader context by the follow-up coverage. The youth programs were the part of the work she was most satisfied with. She had not overexposed them. That would have defeated the purpose and contradicted the instinct that had made them meaningful in the first place. But she had made them visible in the right way and in the right places, so that the programs were now part of the record without being performed or presented as anything other than what they had always been, an ongoing commitment by a private man who did not require acknowledgement for the doing of it. She printed the final report on the Thursday evening and read it through from beginning to end, making small corrections with a pencil, the same way she always did the final read of anything important. She was finished by 10. She set the report on the desk and looked at it for a moment. She had 11 hours before she would hand it over, pack her bags, and leave Ashford Hall. She went to the library because she had spent enough evenings in it, over 9 weeks, that it had become the room she thought of as hers, in the particular way that temporary rooms sometimes became yours without your planning it. She lit the lamp on the reading table and sat down with the novel she had been working through for the past 2 weeks, the one that had been left outside the guest room door. She did not read. She sat in the quiet of the library and thought about 11 hours, and what 11 hours meant at the end of something. At 10:30 the door opened, and she was not surprised that it was him. They had both spent enough late evenings in this room, arriving independently and staying for the same reasons, that his presence was not a surprise. He came in and looked at her and at the book on the table in front of her, and he did not say anything immediately. "The report is done," she said. "Good," he said. He came to the chair across the reading table and sat down. "It's thorough," she said. "The next 6 months are outlined in detail. Helen has the contacts and the frameworks. Philip has the response protocols. The pieces that need ongoing attention are flagged. I know you'll have covered everything," he said. She looked at him. "You haven't read a draft of it," she said. "You've been very careful not to ask to see the process drafts." "I trusted you with it," he said simply. She held his gaze. 11 hours, she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to complete this professionally," she said. "The handover, the report, the final briefing with Helen and Philip, all of it." "I know you are," he said. "I wouldn't expect anything else of you." "And after that," she said. He looked at her steadily. "After that," he said, "is not tonight. Tonight is still the 9 weeks." She nodded. "You're right. But after that is real," he said. "Whatever form it takes. I want that understood." "It's understood," she said. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, The Wiltshire night was absolutely clear, and through the library's tall windows, she could see stars with a particular density that was only visible far from city light. "Argue with me about the interview," he said. She looked at him. "The political magazine versus general interest." "Yes," he said, "you were right, but I disagree with your reasoning, even though I agree with your conclusion." She almost laughed. She felt the edge of it. "Tell me why you disagree with my reasoning," she said. He told her. She disagreed with his disagreement and told him so. He constructed a counter-argument with the precision she had come to expect from him, and the dry undercurrent of humor that he deployed rarely and well, and she dismantled it, and he disagreed with the dismantling, and they went around the argument for the better part of an hour in the quiet library while the fire burned low, and it was, she thought, one of the better hours of the past 9 weeks. At midnight she closed the book on the table and stood. He stood with her. "I want to tell you something," she said, standing across the reading table from him. "And I want to tell it to you as the person who has been here for 9 weeks, not as the consultant completing the engagement." He waited. "The work was worth doing," she said, "because the subject deserved to have the truth told, but it was also worth doing because of what it was. The 9 weeks. The way you engaged with the process." She paused. "The way this house held up in the dark." She paused again. "I'm glad I didn't turn it down." He looked at her across the table. "So am I," he said, very quietly. In the morning, she handed the report to Philip in a formal briefing that was precise and complete, and conducted with full professional composure. She did a final session with Helen, walking through the 6-month plan point by point, making sure that every element was understood, and that Helen had everything she needed to continue the work with the same structure Mara had built. Helen thanked her with the particular warmth of someone who had watched the whole engagement unfold and understood its value. She packed her case. Mrs. Portman was waiting in the entrance hall when she came down. The housekeeper took Mara's hand in both of hers and held it briefly, and looked at her with the sharp dark eyes that had taken in everything and commented on nothing for 9 weeks. "Come back for the garden in spring," Mrs. Portman said. "It's quite different then." Mara looked at her. "I'll remember that," she said. She carried her case to the car. Arthur was on the gravel path, and he stopped and looked at her, and raised one hand in a brief salute. That was his version of a warm farewell. And she raised her hand in return. Edward walked her to the car. They stood in the gray December morning on the gravel drive with the cold air between them and the wide pale sky of Wiltshire above them, and she was aware of all the things that were not being said, and she was aware that not saying them was the right choice for this moment, and that the right choice was not always the easy one. "The report is strong," she said. "I know it is," he said. "Helen will be excellent," she said. "She always has been," he said. "She simply needed the right structure to work within." A pause that was comfortable and uncomfortable in the same moment, the way the last moments of things always were. "After this," he said, "I mean what I said, whatever form it takes." "I know," she said. "So do I." He nodded. He looked at her in the particular direct way that she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply learned to receive. She got in the car. The drive was 2 hours and 12 minutes. She did not turn the radio on. She watched the Wiltshire fields give way to the suburban approaches of the motorway, and then to the outskirts of the city, and she thought about what a thing it was. The 9 weeks. The conversations. The kitchen at midnight. The first edition book. The argument about the interview that had made her almost laugh. The way he had stood in his own doorway on the first morning, looking at her, with the brown eyes that held none of the apology she'd expected from a man in crisis. She did not have a word for what the 9 weeks had been, professionally or otherwise. She thought that was probably correct. The things that mattered most rarely arrived with their own accurate words already attached. 6 weeks in London. That was how she categorized the time afterward, in the private filing system of her own mind. 6 weeks in London. As if it were a separate era, clean-edged and finite, bracketed between the December morning she drove away from Ashford Hall and the morning the letter arrived. She returned to her flat in the first week of December, and she cleaned it and organized it and restocked it, and went to her office the following Monday morning, and briefed Genevieve Hart on the completion of the Ashford Wren engagement. She answered emails. She filed the final invoice. She submitted the monitoring data and the end of engagement report to the Hartwell and Associates record system. She was thorough and prompt about all of it, because thoroughness and promptness were things she could control. She took on a new client in the second week. He was a city councilman named Douglas Garrett who had a tax disclosure problem that was more complicated than his existing legal team had told him it was, and sorting out the communications implications of it was the kind of work that required her to be completely present and not thinking about Wiltshire. She was mostly completely present. She spoke to Lucy 3 times. Lucy did not ask about the engagement, which was a choice Lucy was clearly making deliberately, and which Mara was grateful for, in a way that confirmed everything Lucy had suspected. They talked about work and Christmas plans and a mutual friend's new apartment and the general state of things, and Mara said nothing about Ashford Hall, and Lucy did not ask, and both of them were performing a version of ordinary that was held together by mutual affection and the shared understanding that when Mara was ready to talk about something, she would talk about it. She was not yet ready to talk about it. She was not, if she was being honest, entirely certain what it was that she would be talking about when she eventually did. She had 9 weeks of something that had built, carefully and slowly and without her permission, into something that mattered. She had a late-night kitchen conversation in the 9th week that had established, without any ambiguity, that what had been building was recognized on both sides. She had 12 minutes on a gravel drive in December, and after those 12 minutes, she had driven 2 hours in silence. And since then she had had a working knowledge of what it meant to not do something that you were aware you wanted to do, and to not contact someone who had said they meant what they said, and to not reach out even when reaching out would have been the natural and obvious and human thing to do. She was not contacting him because she did not know how, not practically. She had Philip's contact, she had the estate's email, she could have found a way. She did not know how in the sense of not knowing what to say that would be honest, without being presumptuous, that would be genuine, without being an overstep, that would honor what had been said in the kitchen, without collapsing the careful space that had been built around it. She was, she understood, very good at managing other people's communications, and quite bad at managing her own, when the stakes were personal. She worked. She was excellent at work. Douglas Garrett's tax disclosure problem was resolved in 2 weeks through a carefully structured voluntary correction statement that she had written herself, and that his legal team had initially resisted, and then, when they saw it work, claimed partial credit for. She did not mind. She had handled the engagement well, and the outcome was correct, and that was the point of the work. She exercised. She read. She went to a dinner party that Lucy hosted in the 2nd week of December, and was good company, and ate good food, and talked to interesting people, and, once, standing by the window with a glass of something warm, thought about the way the Wiltshire fields had looked from the south side path in November, and pushed the thought away before it could develop into anything useful. Christmas came. She spent it with her mother and her sister in the house where she had grown up, in a town in the north of England that was always more itself in winter than in summer. It was a good Christmas, in the specific way that family Christmases were good when you were paying attention to them rather than thinking about something else. She paid attention. She was glad she had gone. She came back to London on the 27th and worked through the last days of the year. The new year arrived. She did not think about what she had said standing at the car on the December gravel. Not in those terms, not explicitly. She thought instead about the work, which was always available to think about, and which had the great virtue of being concrete. She had been working on Douglas Garrett's next quarterly communications plan for 4 days when the letter arrived. She saw the handwriting on the envelope before she had fully registered what the envelope was. She was in the kitchen of her London flat at 7 in the morning, going through the post the way she always did while the coffee was running, and she picked up the cream-colored envelope and turned it over, and saw the handwriting, and stood quite still for a moment before she opened it. It was 4 pages, written on paper that carried the watermark of the Ashford Hall household stationery. The handwriting was the same she had recognized on the kitchen note in the first week, precise, slightly narrow, completely legible. He began with a question about the book he had left outside the guest room door, whether she had argued with it the way she argued with everything else, or whether she had, in this case, allowed it the uncontested space he suspected it probably deserved. He said he had been going back through his father's library in the East Wing, and had found another 3 novels he thought she would find worth arguing with. He offered no further explanation of why he had been spending time in the East Wing, because it did not require one. He described the estate in January, the fields frozen, Arthur engaged in a running disagreement with the South Path box hedges that appeared, from Edward's account of it, to be going strongly in Arthur's favor. Mrs. Portman had reorganized the kitchen in a way that seemed to be motivated primarily by a strong personal conviction that the previous arrangement had been wrong for decades, and the household had adapted to the new geography with varying degrees of success. He described the second press interview, which had been the general interest piece she had been right about, and which had run well, and which Frances Webb had referenced positively in a follow-up piece of her own. He described the Somerset Mentoring Site's winter program and a conversation he had had with George, who had apparently expressed a strong and unsolicited opinion about the quality of the roof section's completion, and indicated that he would be watching the spring weather carefully for any evidence of inadequacy. And then, in the 4th page, in the last paragraph, in the same measured precision that he brought to everything, he wrote, "I have spent the past 6 weeks being deliberate about not contacting you before I had something honest to say, rather than something that was simply the product of missing the particular quality of a conversation with someone who will not allow you to be careless about words. I find, now, that I have something honest to say. I have no interest in the version of things that does not include you in it. I wanted you to know that, in writing, without the context of anything professional between us. You can do with it what you think is appropriate. I trust your judgment in most things. I trust it in this too." Mara read the 4 pages. Then she read them again. Then she set them down on the kitchen table and stood at the window with her coffee and looked at the London morning outside and thought about the particular quality of honesty that she had encountered on the first morning at Ashford Hall, when a man who was supposed to be a character had turned out to be a person, and about all the small specific things that had accumulated over 9 weeks into something she had not planned for and had not managed and had not been able to leave cleanly behind her. She went to the table and picked up the letter again and read the last paragraph a 3rd time. Then she picked up her phone and found the number she had not called in 6 weeks. Her thumb was over the number. She hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds less than she had expected. She called him. He answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had been waiting with the particular disciplined calm of someone who had learned to wait well and disliked it as much as anyone else. "I argued with the book," she said, without preamble. A pause, brief and complete. "I thought you would," he said. "You were wrong about Chapter 9, she said. "I'll tell you why." "I don't think I was wrong about Chapter 9, he said. "I look forward to hearing your reasoning." She stood in her London kitchen, and he was in Wiltshire, and the distance between them was countable in miles, and felt, in that moment, like something that had a solution. "The letter was well written," she said. "I revised it several times," he said. "I wasn't going to be careless about it." "No," she said. "You wouldn't be." A pause. "How soon could you come to Wiltshire?" he said. "Not urgently, just directly." She looked at her calendar in her head. Douglas Garrett's next critical moment was 2 weeks away. She had 2 other clients in active phases, both manageable. She had a Monday morning she was supposed to spend on planning documentation for the 1st quarter. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he said. She ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the phone still warm in her hand, and the letter on the table, and the London morning outside the window, and she thought, yes, this is what honest feels like when it is aimed at the right thing. She went back to her coffee and began thinking about what she wanted to say about Chapter 9. Saturday came cold and clear, with the particular January light that was low and direct and made everything slightly more vivid than it had a right to be. She drove, with the window cracked and the radio low, and the fields of the home counties gave way gradually to the broader landscape of Wiltshire in the way she remembered from the first drive, back in the autumn, when she had not known what she was driving toward except a file of press clippings and a 12-week contract. She knew more now. She was driving with more information and less certainty, and what she was discovering, at 65 miles an hour on the M4, was that more information and less certainty was a more comfortable condition than she had previously given it credit for. The gate at the bottom of the Ashford Hall drive was open when she arrived. She had not announced a time, only a day, and the gate was open. She parked on the gravel and got out, and the cold hit her, clean and sharp, smelling of frost and the very faint green edge of the dormant garden. The hall stood above the drive in its usual authority, the Georgian facade composed and pale in the winter light, the windows catching the low afternoon sun in the way that old glass did, differently from new glass, with something more complex in the reflection. The door opened before she reached it. He was standing in the doorway in the same dark sweater and plain trousers, or another version of the same dark sweater and plain trousers. It was genuinely impossible to tell, and he was looking at her with the steady brown eyes that she had missed with a specificity she had not allowed herself to examine too closely during the 6 weeks in London. She climbed the steps. "You were right about the General Interest magazine," he said. "I know," she said. "I was also right about Chapter 9. "We'll discuss Chapter 9, he said. "Come in." She did. What followed was not a simple thing, and it was not a managed thing, and it was not a thing that either of them would have designed if they had been designing it from the outside. It was two careful and private people who had found each other in the particular compressed context of a crisis engagement, and who were now faced with the ordinary, complicated, unmanaged business of being known by each other outside of that context, and finding out what that meant. It meant that February brought a photograph. She had not been careful enough, coming out of a public lecture in London that she had attended, and that Edward had also attended, separately and at her suggestion, because the topic was relevant to the ongoing mentoring program strategy. A photographer from a mid-level tabloid caught them on the pavement outside, standing together, and the expression on her face in the photograph was the one she did not always have control over, which was the expression of someone who was in the middle of saying something and is also very interested in the person they are saying it to. The photograph ran the following morning. Her phone rang 11 times before 8 o'clock. She handled it. She was, after all, very good at handling these things. But handling it as the subject of the coverage, rather than the manager of it, was a different experience than she had expected. And she sat in her flat on the morning the photograph ran, with a cup of coffee, and her phone going off, and thought about what it meant to be on the other side of the process she had spent 7 years building. Edward called at 8:30. "Have you seen it?" he said. "I have managed worse," she said. "That isn't what I asked," he said. She looked at the photograph on her laptop screen. She was, objectively, more exposed in it than he was. She was the one whose face was fully visible, whose expression was fully legible, who had been on the pavement in a moment that she had not been performing for anyone. "It's fine," she said. "The expression is incriminating but not embarrassing. I look like someone who is engaged in a conversation they are enjoying. That is a characterization I can live with." "You could not have managed it," he said, very directly. "The photograph. You could have made sure it was not taken. You did not." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "I didn't." "I'm glad of that," he said, "for what it is worth." "It's worth something," she said. What it also meant was that Philip Croft had to make one brief call to one editor to establish that Miss Ellison's relationship with the estate was no longer professional in character, and that the estate's official stance was that private life was private life, and the editor had made a decision that was partly editorial and partly based on 6 months of Philip Croft being honest and responsive with him, and the photograph generated 2 days of minor online commentary, and then settled. She drove to Wiltshire on the following Saturday, and the one after that, and the pattern that established itself was not dramatic or particularly remarkable from the outside. A woman who drove from London on Saturdays and stayed through Sundays and sometimes Mondays when her schedule allowed, eating Mrs. Portman's cooking and working in the library and arguing about books and the communications plan and the Somerset mentoring program's expansion and whatever else presented itself as worth arguing about, which was always something. It was not a fairy tale, and neither of them wanted it to be. Edward's life carried the particular specific weight of a title and an estate and a public existence that he had been navigating for 14 months as the Duke, and for 38 years as the person who would one day be the Duke, and none of that was simple. There were things she had to learn about moving through a world that had rules she had not grown up with, and she learned them with the same focused attention she brought to everything else, and made mistakes along the way. And when she made them, he corrected her with the particular dry precision that she had learned was his version of gentleness. There were also things he had to learn about sharing space with someone who thought at the speed she thought, and who would not be managed, and who had, on at least 3 separate occasions, been technically correct in an argument about his own estate's communication strategy, in ways that he found both inconvenient and impossible to argue with. He learned them with the patience that she had understood about him since the second week at Ashford Hall, when she had watched him sit with difficult information and process it without rushing and without deflection. April came, and the garden at Ashford Hall was, as Mrs. Portman had promised, quite different. The formal garden south of the house came into its proper form in the spring, and the fields beyond it turned from the winter gray to a green that was almost offensive in its clarity. And the river at the bottom of the south path ran fast with the spring water, and caught the light in the late afternoon, in a way that made the walk Mara had taken in November look like a different place entirely. She stood at the river one Saturday afternoon, in April, with her coat open and the spring air properly warm for the first time, and Arthur Gale came around the bend of the path with his wheelbarrow and stopped and looked at her. "Garden looks well," she said. "It does," he said. "It was worth waiting for," she said. He looked at her in the quiet, unhurried way that he looked at everything. "Most things are," he said. He continued down the path. She stood at the river for another 10 minutes, listening to the water and watching the light. Then she walked back up the path to the hall, and the door was open, because it was always open now, and she went inside. She had been hired to protect the Duke's reputation. She had done that. The work had been thorough and complete, and the record would show that the engagement had achieved what it had set out to achieve, and that was a clean professional outcome that she was proud of. She had not been contracted to sit at his kitchen table at midnight, or to argue with his books, or to learn that he laughed quickly and rarely, and that the laugh, when it came, was entirely genuine, in a way that she had not expected, and had found, from the first time she heard it, difficult to set aside. She had not been hired to find that what a person does in private, not for recognition, not for the record, not because anyone is watching, but just because it is the right and correct thing, is the truest version of who they are. She had not been hired to fall in love with the gap between who he was and who the world thought he was. But she had sat in that gap for 9 weeks, and afterward, for 4 months of Saturdays and Sundays, and what she had found in it was not a project, and not a client, and not a careful professional relationship with appropriate boundaries maintained. What she had found was a person who matched the particular frequency of her own honesty, which was something she had not known she was looking for until she found it. That spring, she took on fewer engagements, not because the work mattered less, but because other things had begun to matter in a way that gave the work its proper proportion. She was still very good at what she did. She was still thorough and precise and effective, and Genevieve Hart, at Hartwell and Associates, had called her personally to say that the Ashford Wren engagement would be in the firm's case study file for years. She had thanked Genevieve and meant it. But she was also the person who drove to Wiltshire on Saturday mornings and walked the South Path and argued in the library and ate at the long dining table and sat in the kitchen at midnight with a cup of tea and a conversation that had no professional context at all, and those things had become as real as the work, and as important, and she had stopped needing to manage that fact. In June, she stayed through the whole week for the first time. On the third evening of that week, coming back through the entrance hall from an afternoon with Helen reviewing the program's 6-month outcomes, she passed the portrait gallery and stopped and looked at the ancestors on the walls the way she had not properly looked at them since the first morning, when she had walked through the door for the first time in November. She looked at them for a while. All those composed faces, centuries of them. She thought, I came here to fix the way people saw one man. I spent 12 weeks in this house building a version of truth that the world could see. The world could then see it. That was the job. That was accomplished. And then she thought, what I did not expect, walking into that study on the first morning with my portfolio and my 12-week plan, was that the truth I was building was also the one I would come to understand best. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, and Edward was coming down the corridor with his sleeves rolled and a book under his arm, the specific book they had been arguing about for 3 days, and he stopped when he saw her looking at the portraits. Are you having thoughts about my ancestors? He said. I'm having thoughts about a lot of things, she said. He came to stand beside her and look at the portraits. My father is not up there yet, he said. The commission is in progress. A pause. I thought I would find it difficult to decide what expression to request, but I found it very easy. He was reading something in almost every memory I have of him. They should paint him reading, then, she said. Yes, he said. I thought so too. He looked at her. She looked at him. The entrance hall was quiet and large around them, and the afternoon light came through the window at the end of the corridor and lit the stone floor with the particular quality of late June, which was warm and direct, and without the complications of other seasons. Chapter 9, she said. We have been over Chapter 9, he said, with the dry precision she had never once tired of. I'm right about Chapter 9, she said. You're wrong about Chapter 9, he said. You are right about many things. Chapter 9 is not one of them. She almost laughed. She felt the full edge of it. She had come to Ashford Hall in November, with a portfolio and a 12-week plan, and the professional certainty of someone who knew exactly what the job was, and how to do it, and when it would end. She had built what she had come to build. She had done it well, and she had found, in the process, something that was not in the brief, and not in the contract, and not in any professional framework she had ever worked within. She had found something that required no management at all. That, she thought, was the part that lasted.